So I want to welcome you back, a special welcome after 2 months a break. We had a good sessions, the first 3 in the fall, and we look forward to the next 3 of these presentations, beginning with Paul Waddell, who will be talking about personal ethics, but then also social ethics will be by Diane Bergant, and then Robin at the end in March on prayer. So I think we have some really, really good topics to reflect on in our own faith life, in our own passionist charism. So it's good to see you all, because it's been a long, I don't know what you want to call it, beginning with the blizzard and winter, the airport meltdown, the storms in California, tornadoes in Alabama, Southeast, and another airport meltdown yesterday. And then we also had 2 days of our pre-chapter, just the past 2 days, Tuesday, Wednesday. So those who were joined on those 2 days, it's good to see you tonight for more Zooming. So let me begin with a prayer, and then Dave will introduce Paul a little more formally. Okay? So we pray, ever-living God, at morning, noon, and evening, we ask that you cast from our hearts any darkness and bring us the light of your truth. This we pray through Jesus Christ, your Son, our Savior, forever and ever.
Amen.
Amen.
And good evening to all of you. I think everybody here knows Paul one way or the other. Many of us have lived with him, taken classes from him. There's not a lot more I can say about an introduction, except, when I was his student many years ago, one of the classes that can be extremely dry when you're studying theology is moral theology. But Paul never made it dry and boring. He always addressed it from the perspective of, how do you really relate to this? Friendship. What do you care about? Goodness and kindness. And so it wasn't reading books that were 800 years old. He had a way of bringing it to life. So we're delighted here, Paul. I know you put out a great introduction for us tonight. I hope everybody took a chance to read that chapter from his book. I know I did, and even if I read it just once or twice, I find myself still preaching on it, because it's something that's just so relatable. So I know this is going to be a very reflective evening. We're thrilled, Paul, that you could be with us tonight, and I'll just be quiet now and let you lead us through the evening. Thanks for being here.
Well, thanks, Dave, for the kind introduction. And I also want to thank Don Weber for inviting me to be part of the series. And thanks to all of you for taking time to be with us tonight. I wanted to mention at the outset that as I was preparing my reflections for this evening, I thought a lot about Father Sebastian McDonald. He was my teacher in moral theology when I was a student at CTU in the mid-1970s. But after that, Sebastian really was a mentor for me until the day he died 2 years ago. So what I want to share tonight was shaped a lot by Sebi's influence on me, but it's also my way to say thanks to him. What I wanted to do tonight is to offer a way for understanding the Christian moral life. And I want to do that in 4 segments. First, I want to suggest that the Christian moral life is essentially all about learning how to be happy. The Christian moral life is essentially all about learning how to be happy. So if that's the case, it wouldn't be wrong to title a course in Christian ethics, "This is Happiness," or "How to Be Happy." So that I want to start with that. Secondly, I want to look at the relationship between narrative and the Christian moral life by suggesting that the Christian moral life is all about taking on and being faithful to a story that is worth the gift of our lives. At the heart, I think that's what it means to live the Christian life, is to take on and to be faithful to a story that is worth the gift of our lives. A story that's so good that by the end of our lives, people can truly say about us, that person really lived. Not that person kind of lived or sort of lived or never really got the point, but that person really lived. Third, I want to turn to the virtues because I don't think it's at all possible to have a life of goodness, a life of happiness, apart from the virtues. So the virtues will be those qualities of being and character that are conducive to true human flourishing. And then finally, I'll conclude by saying a little bit about the role of friendship in the moral life. And even though I'm putting that at the end, really everything that I'm going to share with you this evening builds on the assumption that the moral life, the Christian moral life, is not something we do all by ourselves. It's a journey that we take with companions, a journey that requires friendship and support. So first of all, how to think of the moral life as learning all about being happy. Now, I suspect that as attractive and as appealing that might sound to you, it also probably took you by surprise. Many of us, when we think about ethics, we immediately connect ethics with moral principles, with rules, with guidelines, with laws and commandments. Or we assume that a class on ethics would focus on difficult decisions of conscience, those hard decisions that none of us wants to face in our life, but sometimes we have to, when there seems that no matter what we choose, we can't do the good in the way that we would like. There's no trouble-free moral choice. So on this motto, we connect ethics with quandaries, with problems and dilemmas. Or maybe if you told someone that you signed up to take a class in ethics, they would immediately assume that, well, you'll dive right into some of the major moral issues of our day, issues connected with medical ethics, with environmental ethics, with questions of war and peace, with matters of justice or injustice. All of those things are important, and they need to be given their proper attention when we think about the moral life. But actually, there's an older tradition within Christianity that connected morality with happiness. The great early church theologian, St. Augustine, built his understanding of the moral life as seeing it as a search for happiness. In the Middle Ages, St. Thomas Aquinas began with the assumption that everybody wants to be happy. It's a natural desire. Nobody has to teach me to want to be happy. So Aquinas says that we live with some ultimate end in mind, some ultimate goal. And whatever that is for us matters more to us than anything else, because we believe once we possess that ultimate end, then we'll be happy, then we'll find peace. But both Augustine and Aquinas also knew that the desire for happiness is not enough to make us happy. You and I may have a natural desire for happiness, but that does not mean that we naturally know what happiness is. So sometimes we can lose our way in our search for happiness. Sometimes we can have an impoverished or deficient understanding of happiness. And maybe when we look back over our life, we can identify points where we took wrong turns on happiness. There's a great example of this in Augustine's Confessions, where he tells the story of the first 33 years of his life before he becomes a Christian. Well, Augustine did his best to try to have to try to make all the right decisions, to plan his life as perfectly as possible. Well, one day he and his friends are walking through the streets of Milan because Augustine has been asked to give a eulogy in honor of the emperor who recently died. Well, Augustine admits he didn't really like the emperor. He didn't care for him, but this is a good career move. If you could put on your resume that I gave a eulogy for the emperor, that's pretty impressive. Well, when Augustine and his friends are walking through the streets, they suddenly come upon this drunken beggar who's sitting on the side of the streets. All he has is a few coins and a bottle of wine, but it stops Augustine, because Augustine looks at this beggar and realizes the beggar seems happier than Augustine and his friends. So it's a great example that happiness, even though we naturally want it, we don't always know where to find it. So just with that as the background, when I talk about Christian ethics as an ongoing education in the nature of authentic happiness, what I really want to do is to broaden the scope of ethics, to broaden our understanding of ethics, so that the heart and center of ethics is wrestling with questions such as, what is a good life? What does a good life look like? Or what kind of life is truly worth living? Or what kind of person should I be trying to become? Normally, when we think about ethics, we tend to ask first, what should I do? But I think a more fundamental question is, who should I be? What kind of person should I be trying to become through the everyday choices and decisions and relationships of my life? There was a great moral theologian named Herbert McCabe, and Herbert McCabe captured this understanding of ethics when he said that we study ethics in order to learn how to be good at being human. I love that description, that we study ethics in order to learn how to be good at being human. So McCabe says ethics is not simply teaching people how to talk about being good, but it's about trying to make people good as well. So with this as a kind of background, I want to make three basic points about happiness. The first is that in a Christian understanding of happiness, happiness is inseparable from goodness. So both Augustine and Aquinas would say, in order to be happy, you have to be good. You have to form your character in goodness. You have to grow in the love and goodness of God. So in Christian ethics, happiness and goodness are intrinsically connected. Secondly, in Christian ethics, happiness is different from pleasure. Pleasures are important, but pleasures come and go. But real happiness is something that lasts. This morning at breakfast, I had a piece of raisin cinnamon toast, and I got a certain amount of pleasure from that because it smelled good and it tasted good. But unfortunately, as soon as I ate the last bite of that raisin cinnamon toast, the pleasure was gone. I'll have to wait until tomorrow morning. On the other hand, there's something about happiness that has to be more resilient, more stable, more lasting. It would be very odd if you asked me, Paul, are you happy? And I said, well, yesterday I kind of was. Today I'm not so sure, and who knows about tomorrow. There's a consistency to happiness. There's a steadiness to happiness. But happiness is also different from pleasure because we can take happiness is connected with goodness and found in goodness. But sometimes we can take pleasure in the wrong things. And unlike pleasure, happiness is not so much an emotional state, but rather happiness is becoming a certain kind of person by taking on a certain way of life. So that's kind of the primary image I want to suggest for thinking about the Christian moral life. It's a journey. It's an itinerary to happiness. but we learn as we go. We don't understand the nature of a truly good and beautiful life all at once. We learn as we go. But we also learn from one another. I want to expand on this a little bit by turning to Augustine. Augustine became a Christian when he was 33 years old in the year 387. A year later, he wrote a little book called The Way of Life of the Catholic Church. And in that book, he has 4 insights about happiness. Augustine says we all want to be happy. He just sees that by observing human people, by observing our behavior. Everybody wants to be happy. But he says we will not be happy if we lack what we love. So that's a very important insight. Augustine is connecting happiness to love. We'll become happy as we learn to love well. So that's why he goes on to say we will not be happy even if we possess what we love, if what we love is harmful. So for Augustine, the Christian moral life is all about love, but it's learning to love the right things in the right way. It's learning to kind of give a priority in order to our love. And then finally, as a Christian, Augustine says, we will not be happy until we have learned to love what is best. And for him, this is God. For Augustine, ultimately, we find happiness and peace when we've learned to love the greatest and most beautiful good, the greatest possible good that Augustine finds in the love and goodness of God. So he's connecting happiness to love, but he's saying, in order to be happy, our loves have to aim high. And sometimes that's the problem. It's not that we love the wrong things, but maybe we expect more from the things that we love than they can really give us. It's not that we love the wrong things, but maybe we invest too much in certain things that cannot give us the happiness, the peace, the contentment that we look for in them. So Augustine says happiness is learning to love God first of all. But even though he says it's learning to love God first of all, he is not saying that we should only love God. For Augustine, God may be the highest good, but God is not the only good. So he strongly affirms the goodness of all other things in the world, the goodness of creation, the goodness of family and friendship, the goodness of study and hard work, the goodness of a fine meal, the goodness of humor and laughter, the goodness of human love. So in other words, human beings were creatures of a variety of needs, of a variety of loves. In order to have a truly good and fulfilling and happy life, we have to respect all the needs of our lives, all the good things of our life. But the key is learning to love all of those things in the right way, learning to love them in proportion to their goodness. But Augustine also said that no matter how hard we try, we will never be perfectly and completely happy in this life. It's no surprise. I think we all know that. Augustine said that first of all, because we can never know and love God perfectly in this world. There's something about knowing and loving God that transcends us, that is always going to remain out of reach. But we can also never be perfectly and completely happy because we are creatures who live in time. We live in history, and we're creatures with bodies. And that means sometimes we'll suffer. Sometimes we'll know pain. Sometimes we'll know affliction and disappointment. Augustine is not saying that those hardships destroy our happiness, but surely they affect them. To lose someone that you love is a terrible thing that causes grief and sorrow in our life. It doesn't necessarily destroy or obliterate our happiness, but clearly it's going to affect us. So there's going to be what I would call a kind of already and not yet quality to human happiness. Our happiness is real, but we grow into it. The very thing that we desire is always out of reach. And that's why Augustine said there's a restless quality to our human life. Ultimately, as he famously said, we will be restless until our hearts rest in God. And Augustine envisioned that resting in God as being in the communion of saints in heaven. There's another aspect to Augustine's understanding of happiness that is really important. For Augustine, happiness is inescapably social. We need other people. We need healthy families, healthy communities, healthy friendships in order to be happy. So Augustine could never see happiness as something that I could achieve all on my own. Happiness is something that we pursue together and can only enjoy together. That can catch us off guard because we live in such an individualistic society where a lot of times we think, if only I was free of other people, I could be happy. If only I didn't have to deal with these people that aggravate me, I could be happy. Well, that would make no sense to Augustine. No matter how difficult we can make life be for one another, Augustine said, human beings, you and I, are social creatures to the bone. It's the deepest need of our nature is the need for others, the need for friendship, the need for community. So other people do not get in the way of my happiness. They make it possible. Other people do not get in the way of our happiness. They make it possible. But the last thing I wanted to say about happiness in the Christian moral life is that ultimately, both Augustine and Aquinas would say, happiness is going to be found in following, imitating, and learning from Christ. So happiness begins in a life of discipleship. In the Christian moral life, Christ is the path to happiness. Christ is the way. So we grow to understand the nature of authentic happiness insofar as we take up our life in the footsteps of Christ. But as soon as we do this, there's a shock to it, because what we learn is that the gospel presents an understanding of happiness that clashes with our customary ways of thinking about happiness in the good life. Jesus connects happiness with loving our neighbors, including our enemies. Jesus connects happiness with forgiveness rather than revenge, with serving others rather than lording it over them. And he even promises us that if we follow his path to happiness, we will know suffering. So what this suggests, I think, is that the Christian moral life calls us to reimagine happiness, to rethink what happiness really is. And we see this especially in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, particularly the Beatitudes. Jesus' Sermon on the Mount presents a very unconventional understanding of happiness. He says that happiness is a matter of mercy, of peacemaking, of truthfulness, of forgiveness, and justice. For him, the Beatitudes are not impossible ideals, but rather they're Jesus' answer to the deep need, the deep hunger for happiness. So in a sense, what I'm saying is that in the Christian life, happiness begins when we answer Jesus' invitation to follow me. That brings me to the whole idea of story and narrative in the Christian moral life. This is something relatively new. It began getting attention in Christian moral theology and ethics back in the mid-1970s, when theologians and philosophers started to think about the Christian moral life connected to story. The one reason that they did so was simply because every human life takes the form of a story, or really takes the form of several stories. There are stories we inherit. There are stories we choose. There are some stories that seem to choose us. And there's some stories that we say no to, that we reject. Not necessarily because there's anything wrong with those stories, but they don't fit us. And also because we cannot possibly live every potential story. Probably the most important story we inherit comes from our families. Our family narratives shape each of us profoundly. All of us were born into stories, were born into families in which a story had already long been in existence. We become part of that story. We contribute to it, and the story continues after us. Where we are born and when we are born is also a significant point of the narratives of our lives. Growing up in Manhattan will lead to a very different story than growing up in Montana. Growing up in either Montana or Manhattan will lead to a very different story compared to growing up in Africa, Latin America, or Asia. But when we're born, and also makes a difference. People born and growing up in a country at a time of war, that will profoundly shape their story. Both my parents grew up during the Depression and in the Second World War. Those became permanent facts of their narrative that shaped their sense of the world. Examples of stories we choose are things like friendship. Every friendship is a kind of story. Every friendship is a unique narrative. The vocations of our life can be seen both as narratives we choose, but also in a way, narratives that choose us, things that we feel called to, are summoned to. Certain pivotal experiences and events of our life shape our story. We fall in love and out of love. We know success and achievement in our life, but we also know failure and disappointment. We know times of great joy, but also times of suffering and hardship. So what all of this suggests is that to be a person is to be formed by several different narratives. And this means it's not so much that we first have a self or an identity and then find a story, but rather our self is story formed. Our identity, our sense of self, comes from the different narratives of our life. But at some point, we actively shape those stories. We become a character in the story, active participants, and even authors of our story. And this is true even with the stories we inherit. I couldn't choose the family that I was born into, but I am called to become an active character in that story, to contribute to that story. Now, at some point, if we think about all the different narratives of our life, at some point we choose a story to live by, a story to guide us. And we choose that story because it offers a more compelling and a more truthful account of what it means to be human. We choose that story to guide and to form and to illumine our lives because we see in it a more hopeful and convincing account of what makes for a truly good and beautiful life. And we probably choose the story to guide our life because we see the kind of persons it produces. We see what living that story does for others. So in other words, I think the best argument for a story is simply watching what does it do to the people who live it. The best argument for the Christian moral life is not arguing on and on about it, but simply looking at what changes, what happens to people who take that story to heart and live it. So I wanted to take these general reflections on story and to look at specifically the Christian story. But before turning to the Christian story, to lift up 4 qualities of what I think constitutes a good story. In other words, not every story that we're invited to take on is worth the gift of our life. Not every story will enable people to say about us, that person truly lived. So here are 4 qualities that I think constitute a good story. First of all, a good story should teach us to recognize, respect, and respond to the full humanity of all persons. A good story should teach us to recognize, respect, and respond to the full humanity of all persons. Now, it's no secret that many stories at work in our world fail to do this. Many narratives in our world today recognize the humanity of some people, but not others. They acknowledge that this group is truly human and therefore worthy of respect, but others are not. Many narratives at work in our society seem to suggest that persons of wealth, possessions, physical beauty, and celebrity really matter more than anyone else. Other stories dismiss people because of their ethnic, racial, cultural, or religious background. And some narratives suggest that the poor, the elderly, the disabled, and the weak really do not matter as much as the young, the healthy, and the productive. So a good story has to recognize, respect, and respond to the full humanity of all people. Secondly, a good story ought to make genuine community possible. It ought to make genuine community possible. If you and I cannot live well without the support and companionship of others, then a good life requires learning to live well in community with others, whether that's in our families, in friendships, in the people we work with, or learning to deal with strangers, learning to live well with people all around the world. So it should teach us how to live well with others. Third, a good story should cultivate hospitality and openness to others, particularly people who might initially make us uneasy or uncomfortable. So I would say that a good story should enable us to see every person as a gift rather than a threat. A good story should enable us to see every person not as a threat, but as a gift. We know that isn't always easy. There's certain mornings, as soon as I get out of bed, I know I should put a sign around me, stay away today. I'm probably going to be more of a threat than a gift today. But if we allow the threat to win out, then what happens? Alienation increases, fear increases, community breaks down. Then fourth, a good story should always be characterized by justice. It should help us create the kind of world where all persons, indeed the whole of creation flourishes. So a good story should create that kind of world by making us people of justice and creating communities of justice, people who learn to live with others in mind. Now, what does all this mean in terms of the Christian moral life? What I've been trying to suggest this evening is that I think the Christian morality is basically a matter of taking on and being faithful to a story. Taking on and being faithful to a story, the story of God that came first to the Israelites in the Old Testament and the story of Jesus in the New Testament. So Christians are storytellers. And we learn that story because we want to live that story in our life. We learn the story because we want the story of Jesus to continue to continue to be told, to continue to be told through us. And at some point, we want to become a character in that story. So for me, a saint is simply a man or a woman who has learned to tell that story well. They're not necessarily above us or separate from us, but a saint, a holy person, is the man or the woman who has learned to tell that story well. So for each of us to get to the heart of the Christian moral life, it's simply to wrestle with the question, what would it mean for you to be a character in this story? What is your role in the story of Jesus? So, and I think we see in the very beginning of the Christian life, Christians understood themselves as having found a new story, a story that they were called to keep alive by being faithful to and imitating the story of Jesus. Now, we can't do this without the virtues. I love talking about the virtues. When I say that, most people look shocked because they think, how could this possibly be interesting? But really, I think there's nothing more interesting than thinking and talking about the virtues, because the virtues are the habitual qualities of being and acting that enable us to live wisely and well. The virtues are their characteristic ways of being and acting that enable us to live wisely and well. So through the virtues, we're able to achieve real excellence as human beings, but also as human communities. Now, the key word here is that virtues are habits. So I'm not a virtuous person if I'm kind one day when it's easy, but don't bother with being kind the next day because I'm irritable. Virtuous people are people whom we can count on being kind, patient, and compassionate over time. Because by practicing those qualities often enough, they become truly kind, compassionate, and thoughtful people. So a virtue helps us grow as human beings in all the right ways. They're liberating ways of living. So you can think of any virtue. Take, for example, the virtue of justice. The virtue of justice teaches us to live with other people in mind. Well, it's important to do that. If I never learn to live with other people in mind, I'm going to cause a lot of misery in life, a lot of harm, a lot of chaos. Or take the virtue of courage. Courage helps us deal with fear. Well, what happens if we are never able to deal with fear in a reasonable way? If we can't do that, then we shut ourselves out of important goods. Or take something like the virtue of patience. If I get angry at every little frustration, I'm not going to have very many friends. Nobody wants being around an angry, bitter, resentful person all the time. So virtues help us grow in human beings in all the right ways. They make our lives as a good whole. But another reason that the virtues are important, if we think of our life as a journey, at some point on that journey, we will encounter difficulty. We will encounter hardship and challenges, adversity, losses, and disappointment. If we're not to be defeated by those things, and if we're not to give up on the journey altogether, we need to acquire certain virtues in our life. St. Thomas Aquinas captured this well when he said, a brave person does not shrink from a journey because of fear of shipwreck and bandits. A brave person does not shrink from a journey, does not give up on a journey because of the fear of shipwreck or bandits. Now, Aquinas was a realist. He knew every human life, no matter how lucky we might be, every human life will know shipwreck and bandits. Every human life will encounter situations that seem to rob us of our happiness, that seem to diminish our well-being. So the virtues help us live wisely and well, even when life is hard. Virtues such as hope, virtues such as courage and perseverance, they help us live wisely and well, even when life is hard. Now, I want to, there's a lot of virtues that we could talk about, but I wanted to give a little attention to the virtue of compassion, because I think it's a virtue that's sorely in need for our time. It's a very essential human virtue, but it's also a virtue that I think is especially fitting for anybody who feels an affinity with a Passionist charism. The virtue of compassion matters because as we journey through life, inevitably you and I meet people who suffer. Well, how do we respond when we're in the presence of a suffering human being? Compassion enables us to respond well. Now, I'm not at all saying that suffering is good, that we should ever seek suffering. But what I am saying is that no matter how undesirable and unwelcome suffering may be, suffering is inevitable. Suffering is inevitable. If that's the case, there has to be a good way of suffering rather than a poor way of suffering. Or to say it another way, how can we make suffering productive of good? How can we make suffering productive of good? This is what compassion enables us to do. With compassion, we make suffering productive of good because we allow our own suffering, our own experience of sorrow and desolation to deepen our sensitivity and affection for other human beings who are suffering. So instead of turning away from them in their suffering, instead of avoiding them or fleeing from them in their suffering, we reach out to them and we befriend them. Compassion literally means to suffer together. So you can't really be compassionate at a distance. You can be sympathetic at a distance or empathic at a distance. But with compassion, we draw near to the suffering and the pain of other human being. And what we do, with compassion, we allow our own experience with suffering, our own familiarity with suffering, to become a gift for others. So if you encounter another human being who is suffering, if you have suffered, then through compassion, you know you can identify and sympathize and help others who are suffering because you know what it's like. You've been there. You've had that experience of life. So with compassion, we allow our familiarity with suffering, our own story of suffering, to become a gift that can bless and help others. Why? Because we don't want a human being to suffer alone. We want to befriend them in their suffering. So compassion is simply the form love takes in response to another human being's suffering. It's an expression of love. It's the form love takes in response to another human being's suffering. Now, why is compassion important for Christians? We're called to be compassionate because God was compassionate to us. There's a Jesuit Christian ethicist named James Keenan, and he speaks of compassion in terms of mercy. And he describes mercy as the willingness to enter into the chaos and messiness of another person's life in order to answer them in their need. So compassion is entering into the chaos, the messiness, the affliction, the sorrow of another person's life in order to answer them in their need. But Keenan says we do this for one another because it's what God in Christ has done for us. If the crucified Christ reveals anything, it reveals that God did not remain distant to us in our suffering, but rather in the passion and cross of Christ, God entered fully into the chaos, the messiness, the sorrow, the pain, the suffering of the world, because God did not want us to suffer alone. So compassion, I think, is an extremely important virtue for Christians, but especially for Passionists, as we meet fellow sufferers on our way. And finally, I want to conclude by just saying a little bit about how friendship can help us in living out this vision of the moral life. When I was in grad school, a long, long time ago, before at least some of you were not even born. But when I was in graduate school in the early 1980s, I read Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics and was kind of going along until in book 8 of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle said nobody would ever choose to live without friends. So he imagines us trying to envision the best possible life for human beings. And he says, no matter what else we might have in our life, we would never, ever choose to live without friends. And it's not just because human beings are social creatures, but for Aristotle, friendship is absolutely integral, absolutely crucial to a generally good and happy human life. So for him, what he's saying is, we become good by spending time with good people. And when you think of it, isn't that what friendship is all about? We don't become good by studying theories of ethics or by just philosophizing about the moral life. We grow in goodness by spending time with good people. Now, why did Aristotle say this? First, he said, consider what happens in the life of any ordinary friendship. Friendship is all about seeking the good of another. It's the basic definition of a friend. A friend is somebody who wants your good. Not everybody does. If you've ever had any good enemies in life, you know they don't want your good. But a friend is somebody who not only wants your good, but does what they can to help bring it about. So friendship forms us morally because it calls us out of ourselves on behalf of others and calls us to be concerned about another person's good, not only when we feel like it, or not only when it's easy for us, but to do this consistently to do it over time. So friendships are morally formative. They help us grow in goodness because they free us from collapsing our world. They free us from being overly concerned with ourselves. But they also form us morally because in the life of any ordinary friendship, we grow in the virtues. I mean, think for a second, what are some of the virtues that any ordinary friendship needs? Well, friendships demand kindness and thoughtfulness. Friendships demand people who are generous. Friendships demand patience because even the people we love the most can sometimes get on our nerves. Friendships demand that we be truthful and honest with one another. I don't know about you, but if I suspect any person who claims to be my friend is suddenly not being honest with me, I pull back. The friendship is going to weaken. Friendships require empathy, a willingness to grow and to change. They require perseverance and courage, but also forgiveness. because sometimes our friends, the people that we care about the most, disappoint us or hurt us or fail us. So Aristotle said friendships are important to the moral life because over time, friends help one another grow in goodness. But a second reason friendships are important to the moral life is that through friendships, we come to know ourselves better. So friendships can be an important source of self-knowledge. If you've ever had the experience that you think sometimes your friends know you better than you know yourself, or sometimes our friends see us better than we see ourselves, or they can surprise us because they can have an insight into us about which we've never even thought of, we've never even considered. So this is why Aristotle said a good friend is like a mirror. A friend reflects us back to ourselves. But there's a catch here. Sometimes I don't really want to see myself clearly. Sometimes I do not want to see myself honestly or completely, especially if there's certain things, certain habits, certain behavior that I'm developing that I need to change. I don't want to admit that sometimes I can be a little selfish or thoughtless or petty. I do not want to admit that sometimes I can be judgmental or harsh or unkind, or maybe a little self-righteous or arrogant. But this is why healthy friendships and healthy communities are important. Friends have a vision of our best self. That's what love is. Love sees who each of us has it in us to be. So a good friend has a vision of your best self, but relates to you in a way that helps draw that best self out of you. So friends should encourage the best in us. They should help us be the person God created us to be. So if over time I'm becoming a little bitter or resentful or petty, I need people in my life, friends and communities in my life, who care enough about me to call these things to my attention. Anybody can flatter you, but only a real friend cares enough to tell you the truth. Anybody can flatter us. That's cheap. That's easy. But only a good friend, someone who really wants what is best for us, cares enough about us to tell us the truth. And then finally, a third reason that friendships are important to the moral life is that they help us stay focused and committed to the most important goals of our life, even when it's hard to do so, and to find joy in those commitments and their goals. So anything worthwhile demands perseverance. No matter how much we might love what we're doing, at some point we get discouraged. At some point we just feel burnt out or fatigued. At some point we don't always succeed. But if these things really are important to our life, we have to find ways to persevere. But I think what the Christian moral life teaches us, we do not persevere alone, we persevere together. Anything difficult is easier to deal with when there are others walking with us. Anything difficult is easier to deal with if we don't have to face it alone. Just having somebody to talk to makes it so much easier to get through tough times. So friends are there for one another. Friends are present and available to us, especially when life is hard. Something as simple as having a friend who makes us laugh is a gift. No matter how life is hard, if I can laugh about something, I know that I can get through it. So what I've tried to suggest this evening is to think of the Christian moral life, not so much as a list of do's and don'ts, but to think of the Christian moral life as a journey that we take together, a journey into a life of happiness or beatitude, where we help one another along the way, where we learn from one another, where we support and encourage one another, but find joy and delight in doing so. So I know that's a lot to take in, so I really thank you for listening patiently. And so now I'll turn it back to Dave, who will take into discussion.
Thank you, Paul. I couldn't help but think, and you began talking about happiness tonight. There's only 26 of us on this call. I guess the rest of the world really doesn't care about being happy, or maybe they have their own definition of what happiness really is. But thank you for leading us into that discussion. Let's just take some time and sit with that. Let's take a 5-minute break and just sit with what you've heard. And then after 5 minutes, we'll move into some small groups. All right, welcome back. Nobody jumped out early, so you must have been having some pretty good conversations in your small groups. Good. If anybody wants to share anything or ask Paul a specific question, feel free to raise your hand. I can call on you. And if nobody has an immediate one, I have an immediate one. Paul, I'd love to hear your definition. What's the difference between happiness and joy? Because I've always heard that Christian joy is this great virtue, and yet you were talking tonight about happiness. How do you distinguish between happiness and joy?
Well, you're not the first person that asked me that, Dave. One time I gave a presentation along these lines, and somebody was really upset at the end, and they said I should be using the word joy, not happiness. Actually, the way I understand happiness is, I think, the way most people also think about joy. That for me, joy is like a deeply possessed quality of soul, quality of spirit, quality of character that kind of defines a person, so that it's not something that's kind of turned on one day and turned off the other. It's also, we know, is one of the fruits of the Spirit that Paul talks about in Galatians chapter 5. So it's both a gift and a grace. But the way I was using happiness tonight would be exactly that I didn't have time to go into it as fully as I would have liked. But I think in any account of the Christian moral life, we also have to talk about happiness or joy as a grace. So like with any grace, we can ignore it, we can leave it dormant, or we can develop it. So as I was using happiness tonight, I would see it really consonant with joy, that it's a deeply possessed quality of character that is the result of sharing in something that is genuinely good. So that's how I would say it. I mean, that in other words, I think we don't aim for happiness or joy directly, but joy and happiness is the result of sharing in and possessing something that is genuinely good. So I guess that's how I would see it. But it's all of this, everything I said tonight also depends on God's grace. But we're called to recognize that grace, to cooperate with it, to facilitate it, to act on it. So I think that happiness and joy could be seen both as a gift, but also as a virtue.
Okay, thank you. Mm-hmm. Anybody have any thoughts, questions, or comments? Or share something from your small group?
Or things that didn't make sense. Or you said, I think he's really wrong here. Mike?
Well, yeah, I'm not going to tell you you're wrong. At the beginning, I guess one of the things I was surprised about is that you were talking about, the purpose of the moral life is how to be happy. And I guess I was sort of thinking that maybe the purpose of my life is to make other people happy, rather than me. Sort of an emphasis on how can I be of use to others, with my own happiness being kind of secondary or an artifact of this basic outward charity. So that's not a question, it's just a comment, but I'd appreciate your comments on that.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right, Mike. And if that wasn't clear, I need to be clear now. That's where I was at the very end when I was talking about, like a Christian understanding of happiness is going to be contrary to how we normally envision a happy and good life, precisely because of your point that if the Gospels tell us anything, we discover happiness by living for the sake of others, by transcending ourselves in love and service to others. So the whole idea that, was Jesus says in the gospel, in order to find our life, we have to lose it. To save our life, we have to lose it. So I think that, from our own experience, a lot of times we can think, oh, I'll be satisfied, I'll be happy, I'll be content when I kind of strategize my life so that everything works out to my own best advantage. And I think our experience is that doesn't work. That it is in those moments of love and care and concern of others that we're fulfilled. So I'm glad you asked that, because the problem with this approach is that without that kind of qualification, it could be dangerously self-centered. So if something doesn't make me happy right away, I just leave it. I go on to something else. And so that's not what I want to say at all, that in a Christian understanding of the moral life, we find happiness by giving ourselves to others, or by committing ourselves to projects, communities, to purposes that are worth the gift of our life. Pope Francis puts this really well in one of his recent writings, and I forget which one it is, but he says that human beings are called to decenter and transcend. And I think that's a great way of putting it. Love is, I decenter, I come out of myself, I transcend myself in order to enter into relationship with others. It's the same dynamic in friendship. So anyway, I'm really glad you asked that, because if people were left with the impression that when I'm arguing for a way of life that's kind of all about me, don't think that. So thank you. I appreciate that.
It was probably just me being confused, but you started out by saying, Mike, you're exactly right. Could you repeat that again?
Well, I should say Mike also told me what he said, what are the Passionists saying about you when they think you can put what you did in a 15-week semester into 50 minutes? And I don't know.
Mike, just so you know, this conversation is being recorded. So if you need for your own happiness to replay that and replay that and replay that, it'll be accessible to you.
Thank you.
Hey, Jack, did you have something to say? I saw the hand wave.
I did. Paul, I really appreciate the distinction you make between pleasure and happiness. When I first came to the Passionist, Kevin O'Malley was our vocations director, and there was a brochure that he used. It was a quotation of Albert Schweitzer. I don't know what your destiny will be, but the only ones among you who will be truly happy are those who have sought and found out how to serve. And Schweitzer, of course, was, a foreign missionary and a theologian and philosopher and so on. But I think that's the distinction I find helpful. It's not so much pleasure seeking, it's service. And we find our most authentic selves by serving, So thank you for distinguishing happiness and pleasure.
Thanks, Jack. Robin?
Well, I liked your conversation, your input about compassion. And I was thinking, I teach this course on God and suffering here. And there's this Canadian Protestant theologian named Phil Zilla. who he and his wife have a daughter who was born with spina bifida. She had something like 16 surgeries in the first 18 years of her life. And in his book, he says his experience was that people are naturally indifferent, not compassionate. When I first read that, I was really struck by it. I disagreed with it, but the more I thought about it, I wondered. He said, you have to overcome indifference to learn how to be compassionate. I think of what, Francis often talks about the globalization of indifference. So I don't know what you want to think of, if you want to say anything about that, but it's really something that stayed in my mind. Are people naturally indifferent, or are they naturally compassionate? So
I guess I think it's an important point, Robin. I think I would put it this way, that it's very easy to become indifferent. And especially if we're in situations where that's seen to be acceptable. And the one thing I didn't get to because of time, but I think what's ties into your question is that every virtue has an opposite vice, so the opposite of the virtue of compassion is the vice of indifference or insensitivity. And even though we can say we have dispositions or inclinations to the virtues, more often than not, I think the reason it's hard for us to develop virtues is that we first have to overcome the opposite vice. And so if I have allowed myself to become indifferent to the needs of others, the well-being of others, the suffering of others, it's going to be easier for me to be indifferent to what they're going through. So, that's why Aquinas said there's the virtues of beginners, the virtues of those along the way, and the virtues of those who have finally arrived. Well, the virtues of beginners, we're trying to develop virtuous habits such as compassion, but usually cannot do that without first wrestling with the vice of indifference or the vice of apathy. But I think that's so true today, that at times there's a callousness to the world, or even I think a kind of cruelty. And that's why I think that there's no way to be human together without compassion. And that's why I think I wanted to focus on that virtue, because not only is there an affinity between compassion and the Passionists, but I think it's such an urgent virtue today, because without it, exactly what you're saying happens. We close our hearts to others. We become hardened, and that's a pretty hopeless condition to be in.
thank you.
May I offer something? A debt of gratitude, Paul, for that question from Robin and your answer. I was telling my group, that several years ago, I attended a weekend retreat given by a scripture scholar, a Franciscan priest, and he talked about and held up an icon and talked about the concept of crucified by virtue. And I had never heard that term, and I had never seen that icon. And it was somewhat jarring in the moment, because, I had a understanding of what virtue was. It was pounded into me from the time I was a young child, to be virtuous, but it begged for me, a duality, that there had to be another side. And so I really deeply appreciate what you just offered. I like that lens, that we can get caught up easily in the virtue and kind of forget the areas where we're maybe not as compassionate as we need to be. I thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, I think to me, the appeal of a virtue ethic is simply, it's easier to do good when we are good. If I can do something because it's a commandment, it's a law, or out of fear of punishment. But in a way, we're called to grow beyond that. I think we become moral adults when we do what is good because we've learned to truly love the good. And that's what the virtues are. You know, each virtue articulates articulates a love for a particular dimension of goodness. And you know, virtues become second nature to us, which is, and then we do what's right, not only because we want to, but we do it with a certain amount of joy, a certain amount of delight, a certain amount of ease and facility. So to me, it's ethics. A really mature moral person is going to be a virtuous person because who they are is based in a love for what is genuinely good and beautiful. But it's not easy.
Paul? Yeah. Paul?
Alex.
I appreciated your reflections on the truth tonight. I find in healing the racial divide is when people are able to speak their truth and be received, not necessarily accepted, but being received is an act of love, and it also builds bridges in this terrible divide that we live in. So I appreciate very much your insights on the truth. When someone loves me, they're able to tell me the true truth.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think that's great, Alex. And I mean, to me, it's why I think a very important virtue today is slowing down enough to take time to truly listen to another person tell their story, because their story will reveal their truth. And to me, that's how strangers become friends. You know, it's doing exactly what you're saying, being open to the truth that lives in another human being, seeing that as sacred and affirming them by saying, I want to hear what you have to say. I want to receive your truth as a gift. But I think you're right. That's where healing begins. You know, that's where community begins.
Yes, thank you.
I need to jump in here because we really are past time. So I need to apologize to Jim, but we do need to call this a night, and we want to honor that time for everybody else. Paul, thank you so much for your presence tonight, for your sharing your thoughts and your ideas. And we look forward to seeing all of you again. We'll get together again in February. The date is February 9th. Again, it's a Thursday night. And Diane Bergant will be speaking to us again. I believe she'll be doing a similar kind of a theme, but reflecting on it from the Old Testament. So thank you all for being here.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
All
Bye.
Bye.